And we should now be live. I don't want to make the mistake I made last time when I was waiting for like 13 seconds of pitch silence, like painful silence at the start of the Bulverism talk. So I was waiting for the signal. I think it works differently when you solocast. It's weird.
Mm.
Well, folks, we're doing a bonus stream. Not doing this solo this time. I'm joined by Simon Roberts, or possibly his evil doppelganger, Robert Simons.
Here's Siggy.
Oh, I couldn't resist it. I mean, it's a nice image. I don't feel it's like as obviously from The Shining, but just the concept really appealed to me. Anyway, we are talking about the uncanny today. And it's a very specific thing. I think we've laid it out. Not just the sort of weird films with that name, but a very specific formulation of a phenomena as laid down by Sigmund Freud. Now, why would we do this? Why do we care about Freud? So irrelevant and discredited today, Simon.
So they say. Yeah, I rather think we need to look again at Freud. The notional discreditation of Freud, I think, is a lot to do with obviously the kind of capture of academe that we're all, very familiar with at this point. But I still think, quibbling with it as a, non-science. Yes, I mean, I wouldn't sort of claim, psychiatry or psychoanalysis anyway in Freud's terms as a science. It's a conceptual framework and one which may have useful parts to it. That's all. I don't think one needs to sort of take the view of, it's all discredited now, which hilariously a number of people seem to do. If you search on YouTube for videos, people saying, why is Freud no longer taught? And you'll get these weird American girls who are just like so annoyed about Freud. It's just rubbish. Penis animated. Well, who thought of that? And they just dismiss it entirely, and I think that's very foolish. And as I said to you before the stream, I'm always suspicious of the degree to which someone is furious about something and wishes to dismiss it. I think, to me, that says there's a sensitive spot and there's something there, and that's why I think it's worth dipping into what Freud actually writes. This is a very dense essay. It can be a bit difficult to get your head around at times. The brain has to somersault a few times, especially towards the end, because he kind of flips things both ways for us. It is both there and it is both not there, and some people are sensitized to the uncanny and some are not. And the way in which the uncanny presents as a concept in Freud may seem very bald and, I guess motiveless. And people might say, well, I just don't buy this stuff, but there's certainly an effect that we can judge. Whether it is an emotional affect that strikes all people is an interesting question. And for me, I think there's an element of the point of view and the uncanny as a feature of dramatic or a literary creation, where there is a distance through which we view its working, and so we then have to assess the uncanny in the light of how it presents to us through the material we've got, but also we can stand outside it and try and see its workings in real life, where I would say it's not necessarily horror. It's not necessarily about fear, although it's a species of a fear that's identified, and Freud gives us some suggestions as to why it has its effect. But it's something that I think presents in all sorts of phenomena, especially in modernity, that we can discuss later as to how we relate to them because of our necessarily involved point of view in modernity, whereas a bit of detachment might show some of the elements of the uncanny surfacing in the mundane.
Well, absolutely. There's, I took it as a personal slight that Freud said that basically his more neurotic patients were more au fait with the uncanny. I was like, hey,
yeah,
shush.
Yeah.
But also that sort of, I won't say translocation of ideas or cross-pollination of ideas. It's already in this essay. He is taking things that he has seen in his patients, he is applying it to literature. And then part of the reason we're doing this is because very well-known people took this essay and used it almost as an instruction manual to apply it to the horror movie, where, of course, by moving it from literature and from psychoanalysis into movie making meant that it had to undergo some. So there'll be things that we draw on quite a lot that Freud can't draw on because it's a totally different medium.
Yeah.
We'll then go beyond that, and just as you said, we'll sort of see if we can take that concept of the uncanny and maybe see where it shows up in our lives.
And I would say that this is a brilliant thing about this essay, because it is like, it's amazing. It's like a free instruction book as to how to make an unsettling film if you want to make films. You know, all of the kind of tropes are there, and he sort of explains the mechanisms. And then obviously, as we've gone away and looked at various things, I mean, the stuff is just sort of bursting out of the screen at you when you've read this essay. And we'll probably go through, you know, a few examples of that later. But there is a thing to say about this that I discussed just before the stream with you, that it's not the be all and end all. You know, Freud delivers you know, a good dollop of ambiguity, as you say, in this particular essay. And at the end, in particular, he sort of kind of leaves it quite flat and says, you know, well, I suppose there is also just the question of, there are things like darkness and silence and solitude, which affect everybody, basically. You know, we all kind of get spooked out by things from time to time. And as some commentator I was listening to said, you know, it feels like a very unfinished essay in some ways as well. And it does rely on elements of work that he did discussing sexuality in previous works as well. So, you know, assumptions about things like castration anxiety, which we'll go on to, you know, mention, and other such things, and you know, will be something that's contingent on perhaps accepting some of Freud's other premises, but he will also refer to, you know, other you know, writers and psychiatrists of the time who were sort of, you know, going into this territory as well.
Yes, and we will not be uncritical in it, and I think the castration complex in particular, I had to strain a little bit to find something that was relevant to what he was saying. But as you mentioned, he does quite a lot of citing of literature that I think is not well known here, which was one of the things that spurred me on to do this stream. I mean, just to reiterate, this essay is important. It is very useful, but it is not easy reading. And I imagine that if a lot of you were inspired to take it up, it would be a hard read. So what we're going to do is give you both a summary of it and an application of it and a wider discussion. So as it is quite dense, I'll kick us off with it with something to make a bit more sense of it. I mean, when you get into it, it is dense. It is pure chaos, but it's not as bad. That's a whole essay up there, by the way, folks. Just you can pause, read it in your own time if you want.
Yeah.
But I have linked to copy in the description, but
and it's only about 21, 22 pages, but it is written in a style where you kind of have to, as I say, be able to do, you know, cerebral gymnastics to get round some of the things that Freud is going into.
True. And also sort of he hits you with about 10 pages of etymology, which itself is quite interesting, because he says in the very start that basically we know the uncanny is a thing, or das Unheimlich in German. I believe he was writing in English to start with, or he must have supported it. I've got a translation here, but he was au fait with English, wasn't he?
I would take it that he was, given that he spent his last year or two in England and corresponded with, I think it was Ernest Jones of the British, was it British Psychiatric Association or something, who I think got him, by his friendship with the Home Secretary at the time, got him you know, an entry visa or a facilitated entry, so Freud could come and live here. So I take it for some time he had been, you know, dealing in the English, and obviously he's comfortable enough to range across European languages to, you know, discuss these nuances in the origin word Heimlich. Do you want to, you know, go into that and sort of kick us off?
I thought it might be a good way to do it. So, and I realised already our first slip of the tongue, it was written in German originally. We got we're leading with translations, but
Okay.
it's that
But his familiarity.
familiarity that allows him to spend the majority of the essay almost on etymology or of where the word comes from. Now, there's a slight curiosity in that, because as he grapples with, he's presupposing that the uncanny is a thing, and he wants to get to a way of explaining it. And he says there are the two approaches he can do, where he can take the label, the signifier we have already given, das Unheimlich, or uncanny in English. He also offers eerie. He works through lots of European languages, which become increasingly unsatisfying until he's basically saying demonic in one language, which definitely not uncanny. But it's a concept that seems well supported in English and German. So he says, we'll look through the signifier first for clues. And then he does a move that I immediately associated with, what's his name? James Burnham of Suicide of the West. It might seem a weird link, but he writes in Suicide of the West about liberalism. And then, so he has to start by defining liberal. And his approach was to say, very much as Freud does, well, this person and this person and this person are obviously liberals. If they aren't liberals, who is? And goes from there to understand principles. Freud takes that second approach in the second half of the essay, and then he moves in to try and resolve it. But I'll launch us into the etymology, because it's fascinating, but really quite painful in part.
Just one prefatory remark before we go in. So the very beginning of the essay, Freud's establishing this interest, partly as a result of the anecdotal examples he has from his clinical work. So the patients he comes across practicing in Vienna, but also his establishing impulse is to describe this as an exploration in terms of aesthetics, which he says is a kind of unfamiliar territory for him. Depicting himself he's casting himself as the sort of rationalist man of science who kind of is not. I always thought he was a bit Ed Dutton-like in a way. He's not really interested in questions of the humanities or these kinds of vagaries of feeling that have suggested themselves to him from his clinical work. But he is very much framing himself in the context of his own life. If you hear discussions of Freud, they say, he was a man of he had artistic tastes, but they were very conservative tastes. He didn't really deal with modernity in any way. There was some contact he had. Some of the early surrealists they saw Freud as their kind of hero. And a lot of them, he didn't really understand them. He kind of rejected the work until eventually he met Dali. At one point, Dali managed to get to Britain in 1938 or 39, just very close to his death, and he brought what's Dali's painting, the something of Narcissus. What's it? Is it the Transformation of Narcissus? I can't remember the one, but people will know the image I mean. And Freud saw that and had a discussion with Dali and found him very interesting and very intense. In particular, he noted his intense and candid eyes, which will become very relevant when we talk about this essay.
Yes.
And he really kind of he actually thought the surrealists, I can see it now, they sort of are worshipping me, and I didn't know why, but I think, yes, this guy Dali's onto something. So that's just interesting there, that this notion of the uncanny is an aesthetic consideration,
but also very well applied, very variable application. But yes, it's very good to note that. Right, so his first way in is to deal with something of a contradiction. And we're translating from the German here, so there will be inevitable inaccuracies. But in short, what he is getting at is that to define unheimlich, you start with something that has this root element, the stem element of heim, which you mostly see in heimlich. And so on the superficial level, you have the thing and its antonym, heimlich or homely in one meaning, and therefore unheimlich is unhomely. It's just the opposite. But he goes beyond that to delve into linguistic creep other etymological associations which attach to the word Heim. So when something is from homely, it's not hard to see how you get to extremely well known. You know, I know it like my home, and from then it goes into something close to your heart. Now you guys will probably, I just assume, you might heard of the how home turns up in the German secret, geheim, Geheimnis Staatspolizei. You probably know best as the Gestapo, but that is the state secret police, Geheimnis Staatspolizei. Sorry. Anyway, so we've already moved into a little bit of linguistic ambiguity, and Freud gives you many other quotations which give you the idea that there's actually something not just, well, Heimlich can be cozy and familiar and comfortable. It also gets to ideas of concealed, secret, dangerous. So what I've done is sort of illustrate here meanings that are far apart for Heimlich and Unheimlich, and also the meanings that creep closer together. So Unheimlich from the start has unknown, also somehow familiar. It's creeping in, it's creeping closer, and you start to get a bit of a linguistic creep, an overlap. And this was one of the keys for him, is that there is an ambiguity, that on one level, the uncanny is what is known and unknown. It's familiar, but it's hidden. It's in the open, but it's secret. That kind of ambiguity and tension is there that interests him. And we had that little quotation there that I thought was interesting. The uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to once was well known and had long been familiar. He also quotes if you've gone with the copy of the essay I've linked in the description on page 132, he says, our attention is seized by Schelling's remark, which says something quite new, something we certainly did not expect about the meaning of unheimlich, namely that the term uncanny applies to everything that was intended to remain secret, hidden away, and has come into the open. So he's managed to go from not just the overlap of linguistic concepts, but to draw out how you can make sense of them.
Yeah, it's a kind of linguistic drift that once you kind of engage with the notion of homely as something denoting coziness, closeness, warmth, intimacy, it then sort of starts to switch and it becomes about confiding, and words like secret, as you say, it's less unfamiliar in the sense it's the unheimlich, it being sort of unfamiliar from the outside, but it starts with this drift of the word heimlich, homely, over towards a sense of unfamiliarity as an emotional affect, let's say, an oddness that that we might say, but it also it kind of has this concept where it endears these hidden elements to itself, and there's even parts where you could say Heimlich. It relates, some writers, or maybe in this essay, have talked about things that are even mystical or occultic. These are sort of attempts at closeness, ergo transcendence of some kind, but they're coded within forms of concealment. And I suppose in the mystic and the occultical, that closeness and transcendence it's within forms of arcana, ritual and artifact. And if you like something like the theatre, that's got an element of that. It all comes with a sense of artifice and props and mise en scène, constructed reality. But we have this, as observers, we have this standoff sense of unease with fakery in some sense, but there is a genuineness about this concealment, if you like. It's the secrets being shared with you, so to speak. So there's that element of the sort of slightly not naughty or transgressive, but the hidden quality gives it a sort of libidinal sort of charge that you're seeing something that other people aren't seeing because of this closeness. And
But
also,
it automatically has a draw because of that.
that's right.
It's, you're familiar. It's something you should be accustomed to, but there's something additional in there, something beyond that means you do actually need to give it your attention.
Yeah. And this hinges upon the kind of emotional, psychological force underlying in Freud's theory, the Unheimlich. He'll talk about in this essay about things that are being locked away or being inscrutable. So there's a kind of a sense of a denial of knowledge, but in a way that securitizes a kind of underlying existential dread, if you like. I was reminded when I was looking at this. There's the Umberto Eco novel, The Name of the Rose, which I've talked about before in other streams. But one of the principal plot points is that it's about this abbey where there are these Benedictine monks in the 14th century, and they've got this amazing library, but nobody is allowed to go into the library because the dangerous knowledge of subversive books is kept in the library. And one in particular is Aristotle's lost second book of the Poetics on comedy. And the Catholic Church, as represented by the Benedictine monks in this novel, are suppressing it because if it encourages laughter, as they say in the book, laughter foments doubt. So, that closeness becomes threatening. And, there are other elements in that book, with various features of the uncanny, the use of mirrors, the double nature of people as, the monks are kind of holy, but they're also sinister. Sort of unsettling use of religious imagery to deter people, repression of sex and intellect. There's a sense in which that is another example of a deployment of the uncanny, because Eco is someone as a literary semiotician who is playing with these things very consciously as a modern writer, reconstructing a world that's using that sense of loyalty and closeness to exemplify its psychological denial of what is actually true.
It's been recommended a few times. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read it. So
it
also sounds like it is it's getting at those ideas. I mean, almost the idea of what's his name? Nicholas Nassim Taleb has a whole section in Black Swan on the unlibrary of Umberto Eco.
Yeah, it's one of those ones. Watch the film, then read the book. It'll make it easier, because the book is very dense and filled with all kinds of language games and irony and sort of medieval scholasticism, but at a very kind of vivid, interesting, and sort of slightly bawdy level. That Eco plays with in that, but there's elements in that definitely echo with what we're doing here in terms of this drift of words. The last line of that book is a Latin tag, which is stat rosa pristina nomina nuda tenemus, and one of the translations is the rose is blown in all but name, and what can we lay hold of but names?
That's a dense idea. I'm trying to pass that out.
So
I mean, I suppose if I'm understanding that correctly, it's almost like the difficult. Is that saying it's sort of the trouble of working from the signifier alone gets you back to?
It's fairly simple. It's the idea that you're taking, reconstructing this medieval world, and you're explaining these modern concepts, but the characters in the book only have the language of scripture to describe their experience. So they reach, if they talk about sexuality, they'll reach for the Song of Songs, and so on. So it's the nature of your experience is defined by the language you use to describe it. So it's a kind of fairly sort of semiotics 101 kind of point to make. But that's relevant to what we're talking about here, is that this the vested, if you like, experiences that you carry inform the usefulness of this concept of Heimlich. And as I say, it sort of slips over into a familiarity that means, as you say, the antonym is also present in the word itself.
Mergu, I can tell you this is live, don't worry, although I did set the time for broadcast wrong initially, so there are some confused people at 8 a.m. this morning. Oops, it happens. And your earlier comment about specific examples, we cover in part 2. We'll get onto that very quickly. Chris Cosgrave has that. He's getting the idea. Something being close to home can make someone feel uncomfortable. Yes. We're getting the idea. I've decided to build on what Freud has done. I thought he only mentions this in passing, so I thought it would be nice to give you the English version of this. Because, of course, Freud writes of das Unheimlich and then tries to unpack that into English. So I thought maybe you would just like to work with the English directly. So, as mentioned, he tries eerie, but of course, that doesn't get it. Whereas uncanny is a word that seems to have taken. That's how it's generally translated. And we can do the same thing that we did with Unheimlich. So canny is mostly an Old Scots word from ken, cunning, a knowledge, right? A knowledge. But it also so it has these associations of being knowing and wise, cunning, lucky even. That was a canny choice. Is much more talking about you were lucky rather than you were intelligent. But within that, it can also get into being ominous and unlucky later in the day. You know, there's a 1900s definition, which is more ominous and unlucky. So it's picking up these the sort of other associations. Uncanny, much earlier, had that association with, you know, the obvious antonym. Oh, it's unknowable. You can't get it. You can't understand it. But it picks up very early on. You know, we've got 1590s, we've got 1773 associations with something mischievous, Machiavellian, malicious, or I really liked not quite safe to trust due to association with the unnatural, with the supernatural. So we with cunning and not quite safe to trust, we've got a little bit of crossover there, and then they both start sharing sort of unearthly and supernatural late in the day. So we have that in English as well. It's not exactly the same, but we do have these ideas of knowing an unknown and then untrustworthy gets in there with our version, and we'll see aspects of these show up at multiple points.
Just one little note I wanted to say about the words that, or rather the languages that he looks at. He looks at various languages: Latin, Greek, English, French, Spanish. And I'd said to you before, I had a sense that the kinds of words that he found that were more or less equivalent in Mediterranean Romance languages were less nuanced, I guess, than the English and German. There was more of a sort of a black and white notion of good and evil, you might say, in those words, and they don't have the kind of uncomfortable drift of meaning that I think he's trading on here.
Yes, and that could just be his lack of familiarity with those languages.
Yeah.
But I'm also quite inclined to believe that, as in fact there is evidence for in Freud's essay itself, that the uncanny, or rather the predisposition to recognize and appreciate that aesthetic, is probably more of a temperament of a type of person, and therefore maybe we could say of a people.
Yeah.
So it may be that observing the uncanny is more conducive, easier to do if you have the mental temperament of the Northern European.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Eskimos with 200 different words for snow, isn't it? Really,
Yeah, that sort of thing.
The sort of differences in, I think I said this about the field in England. The way that Diane Purkis was talking about how in the old world, light and dark, if you like, are kind of more significantly, differentiated from each other. We have these, long days and light nights in the summer, and the winters are really long and really dark. in other countries, it's less. It's kind of less pronounced in the way it is here. There's none of those sort of that drift over sort of temporalities that happens. When we talk about a summer's night in England, it's interesting. I went back to Australia a couple of years ago, and I was reminded, because I used to live there, that the summer there, yes, it's very bright and hot, but the light goes dark by about 6 or 7 in the evening. And I'd forgotten that. I'd forgotten my sort of relish for the English summer, the way that the daylight will go on till up to 10 o'clock at night at the point of high summer. So there's something about that contrast. And in the linguistic sense here, he mentions about, in Arabic and Hebrew, uncanny really just resolves down to, as you said, demonic or gruesome, and that doesn't really satisfy the sense we have of it as covering this sort of uneasy territory. It's not quite as bald and final as, yep, it's just bad, it's just awful, it's gruesome. We've got a few more shades than some of the countries, as I say, further towards the east and the south, where this thing seems pretty cut and dried, and there's no nuance to it.
No, absolutely. I'm very inclined to believe that this is a thing that we see. Pandit said, I find etymology interesting but not inherently important. Fair enough. Well, the 10 pages of it that start this essay would probably not be to your taste, my friend. But again, this is why we're summarizing to it. We'll get into next section 2, which is where I think it's much more applied. This is where it will make it's much easier to grasp, essentially. And this is how can I say, being applied. We'll go through this, and we'll also show you where these things have turned up in horror movies. But I should foreground this, of course, because the most obvious example that we'll get is going to be The Shining. And that comes for a really interesting reason. I'll assume that most of you know a fair amount about The Shining. You will know, pretty much everyone knows, it's so different to the book. My gosh, it's so different to the book. He changed the ending. Stephen King was furious. He was Stephen King, etc. We all know that. But I think a lot of the conversation moves to, what does a different ending mean? But there isn't as much talk about why the ending is different. And that's because Kubrick, as well as wanting something that was going to be commercially successful, so he was always a bit embittered about, I shouldn't say embittered, he was conflicted because he wanted something artistically meritorious and genuine, but he also craved the sort of recognition and reward of a commercial hit. And he'd been offered, he didn't have a huge interest in horror, and he'd been offered The Exorcist and turned it down. And then Friedkin goes and makes The Exorcist in 1973 and showered with Oscars. And I think it's that direct experience that made Kubrick say, after being snubbed for film after film, only getting technical Oscars, he thought, no, I'm going to do a horror. I'm going to make it serious, and I'm going to get that award, darn it. So he took the book from Stephen King. He got a gallery draft in 1977 before it was published. And I think he knew straight away, it's going to have the name recognition. King's books were hot properties. There'd been a bunch of successes. Carrie had been successful in 1976, etc. But he wanted to develop something serious. He didn't, I think, find the content of the book rewarding. So in typically for Kubrickian fashion, he goes to delve deep, and he ends up talking to an academic called Diane Johnson, who is an expert in Gothic horror. And she connects him to a range of other sources, such as Shirley Jackson, someone that King very much appreciated himself. And also, notably, this essay, Das Unheimlich. And as we go through some of these examples, I've not pulled them all from The Shining, but just think about how many of these turned up in The Shining, whether or not they were in the book. Were they given additional prominence, or were they just added in seemingly out of nowhere? Well, no, not out of nowhere, out of das Unheimlich. So, but of course, we're talking about Kubrick there. We need to turn to Freud, and what is one thing that we can be pretty sure Freud wants to talk about? So.
Well, should I lead off on this question of loss of eyes?
Please do.
So he's taking this from recollection of a work by E.T.A. Hoffmann, who was a kind of pioneer of sort of German Romanticism, and especially a kind of Gothic kind of literature. And in this particular story about the Sandman, he describes this mythical character, the Sandman, who comes at night. He's fated to alleged to pour sand in children's eyes and thus cast their eyes out, tear them out. And Hoffmann's story is about this character Nathaniel, young man who grows up. I suppose we would say these days, we'd be very dramatic and say he was traumatized by this particular fairy story about the Sandman, and I won't spoil it. Well, I will spoil it. He comes to a bit of a bad end, but and essentially he himself he falls in love with what is essentially an automaton. And this is something which, by various other steps, including sort of an allegory about optics, means that in the end, I can't remember what he actually does. Does he actually cast out his own eyes? Because I know he jumps out of a tower in the end, doesn't he, and kills himself?
I think he has to. He's obsessively looking through the lens or the spectacle, not
That's
spectacles,
right.
the telescope.
Yeah.
Crafted by the man he believes to be the Sandman.
Yeah.
And then throws himself off the tower.
Yeah. And for Freud, this, via things like the Oedipus complex, essentially relates to castration anxiety. And so this is one of these points where, I think we can acknowledge that the modern mind may find this a kind of a bit of a stretch. But essentially, Freud, goes over it at length, and he acknowledges that and says it's of course a perfectly rational fear to be worried about losing your eyes, especially as a child. The idea of not being able to see is an horrific one, but it's from his clinical practice that Freud actually, when delving down into the basis of these kinds of neurotic complexes, finds that there is essentially a fear of the father figure, a fear of an impotence as a punishment by the father figure. And this is what, as a motif, he believes then becomes very powerful in the context of literary creations. We have to sort of emphasize that the uncanny within the literary creation has a degree of power, which, of course, it may not have in real life, but as an allegory, it seems to inflict a certain affect on us that we recognize as the uncanny. And looking at other examples of this, you could see, for instance, you take a film like Red Dragon, the sort of Hannibal Lecter story.
Yes.
You have the Francis Dolarhyde character, the Red Dragon himself, who is this guy who has, he's been a bit sheltered, let's say, and he embarks on this series of murders. He does this very peculiar thing that the people he murders, he takes these photographs and he smashes mirrors and implants these shards of these mirrors, these bits of glass, onto the victim's eyes, so that he can kind of see his own transformation into the dragon. This is interesting.
That does a decent job of connecting the idea into it. I did come across another example that I felt was maybe a bit of a stretch, so I was very glad there is the Red Dragon one. And that was Blue Velvet. Now, you guys might see this as a bit of a stretch. I hope I don't see too many reaches in the chat. But if you haven't seen Blue Velvet, our young buck protagonist, Jeffrey, is, I'll simplify, visiting a woman he's due to have a sexual encounter with. But the return of her lover, Frank, sends him scurrying back into the closet. Yes, into the closet, folks. And he is forced to watch through the slats in the closet as Frank dominates and abuses the woman he would be loving. And you get these focuses on his eyes as he's sort of kept away. It's like his eyes are vying to be the sexual organ in this scenario, but he's effectively being, emasculated, castrated by being locked away in the closet and forced to just witness.
Yeah, and this is an important theme, if you like, in film, especially, of all things as a visual medium. Freud, as I say, he had a glancing interest in what the surrealists did. He wasn't terribly interested in film at the time, but this notion of voyeurism, as I said to you earlier, it's a mode of impotence that compels the voyeur to keep returning to the image seen by their own eye as a connection to power over a sexual impulse that has kind of been abandoned in them personally. So it is a kind of what's the word? It's about a relation to the narcissistic, in a sense, that the attempt to reclaim, if you like, control over the libido is invested in this act of looking that the other person can't stop, and that you can. But the horror, of course, is of discovery. As you see in this shot in Blue Velvet. There are other ways that the eye looking is about the eyes seeing the true self, or trying to see the true self, but they're actually closed off even in the act of looking to acknowledging the true self, acknowledging the neurosis. There's another film I'll reference here, Peter Greenaway film, The Draftsman's Contract, about this is in the late 17th century. A very cavalier, draftsman is engaged to paint pictures of a country house, and in so doing, he forges a contract with the mistress of the house to enjoy sexual favors from her while he does so, and she's very vulnerable to that. And in the end of the film, he is kind of destroyed by maintaining that contract by other interested parties. And one of the things they do is in the sort of ultimate scene of the film, he's been lured to a spot to paint a 13th picture of the house, obviously a significantly
13th day.
For him, and as he is seized on by his enemies, they give him a new contract where they say the contract's first condition, and there's no need to write it down for you will never see it, is to cancel your eyes. And they burn his eyes out at that moment. So this is obviously going to be very much a sort of key arena for the nature of the uncanny, what you see and what it means, and what it is in effect concealing as you see it. What is the sort of the terror underneath it? And for Freud, this goes straight to, in terms of castration anxiety, the idea of this is all based on repression. This is what we're doing.
Yes, I mean there are even older examples, and the Peter Greenaway one sounds perfect. What came to my mind thinking about this is, so Old Testament, the sons of Noah are, one is severely punished. That's by euphemism, because I can't remember if he's killed or not, for uncovering his father's nakedness. So, which is in some way by gaining knowledge of through the visual. Now, there are different translations of it, but on the face of it, it's that act of seeing alone is a form of conquest. Or a form of sexual impropriety, and the use of the peephole as well comes out just like gaining the knowledge of. It's already a form of intimacy, the eye is a sexual organ. Now, Freud, I think, suspects that we may be a bit skeptical about this, or the average reader would be. He brings up Oedipus when the mythical criminal Oedipus blinds himself. This is merely a mitigated form of the penalty of castration. And he writes, taking up a rationalistic stance, one may seek to reject the idea that the fear of damaging the eyes can be traced back to the fear of castration. One finds it understandable that so precious an organ as the eye should be guarded by a commensurate anxiety. Indeed, one can go further and claim that no deeper mystery and no other significance lie behind the fear of castration. Yet this does not account for the substitutive relation between the eye and the male member that is manifested in dreams, fantasies, and myths. Nor can it counter the impression that a particularly strong and obscure emotion is aroused by the threat of losing the sexual organ, and that it is this emotion that first gives such resonance to the idea of losing other organs. You can hear the argument shaking a bit there. It's wobbling on the axis. Now, this is where Freud deploys his coup de grace, right? Mm-hmm. And he will do this at multiple points in the essay, so you can read it yourself. It's not mega long. We are summarizing it for you. Any remaining doubt vanishes once one has learnt the details of the castration complex from analyses of neurotic patients and realized what an immense part it plays in their mental life. In other words, if I haven't convinced you, source my patients. Their neuroses as interpreted by me. Now, that sounds a lot more cynical than I intend it, but I think there are useful ideas here, but it's possibly overstating. And I suppose I'm particularly critical of that.
Yeah.
Because Freud rejects that other aspects of uncanniness that he identifies in the story The Sandman are the key elements. And he says actually the castration complex is the main uncanny element in it.
Yeah. The neurotic relationship to the parent, essentially. That's what he's deriving this from. And as he says, from his clinical experience, there's always this sort of, case history where everything can devolve to, the fear of the punishing father or the fear of the devouring mother, and Freud, again, you can see these sorts of themes. Again, a lot of my references are not necessarily horror films. These are things which pop up in all sorts of, cinema. You could take an example, like the film Amadeus, about, the idea of Mozart as a kind of, scatological, infantine genius. But one of the key relationships in that film is his fear of his father, who he suspects will summon him for punishment because of his wayward creativity. And there's a very sort of complex relationship there, where when his father dies, and then his rival Salieri sends a messenger to him in the night, dressed as a dead kind of warning sort of father figure, this really breaks him. This is a sort of an example of the uncanny. And Mozart, as we see in the film, he kind of writes it into his opera as the Commendatore, the statue in Don Giovanni that comes to life to drag Don Giovanni down to hell for I think raping the Commendatore's daughter in life. So this fear of father, the father's withheld love, or the desire for father's approval, invested in this, this kind of notion.
Yeah. You did also highlight another element that's also present in The Sandman, as you mentioned. That is the ambiguously animate object. Now, in The Sandman, that's Olympia the doll. I'll move us on.
Yeah.
So you've got the statue that comes to life. We got the animate doll. And this is something Freud obviously picks up, but doesn't say is the main thing, whereas I feel is a much stronger candidate for something we find, or it's easily identifiable as something uncanny. It was, I think, one of the first things Mergut said was dolls. Was it the first one? Where is it? I'm looking for your list of examples. Oh, curses. It was third in the examples. There we go. and I've already tried this on you, Simon, but I'll offer
This
it to chat.
Yeah, this freaked me out when I first saw it
Yeah.
because I did genuinely have that confliction about it. And you talked about things like waxworks, which are in a way it's sort of strangely archaic art form, which have an uncanniness of their own in the present day. When you think this was an art that was, developed and refined, by man to sword, during the French Revolution, when bodies became available, at a sort of regular kind of lick, and the process of creating these simulations was so I guess in a sense technologically advanced by the way we might judge things today. In terms of available, material science, so to speak, with the effect that was created by it. This, in a sense, was kind of the CGI of its day. The hyper realist simulation, and you might want to explain more about this image. But I was genuinely struggling at first with it.
Yes. Now I'm wondering if how certain chat is over which one is really Archul or rubbish attempt at a Geordie
This is
voice.
Geordie Songstrol, Cheryl Cole, is it?
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one, or whatever surname is there at the present. But I just thought this was perfect. I looked at many examples of the waxworks, but this was the most. Well, we're going by aesthetics. This one gave me the most uncanny feeling because I really struggled to work out which was.
Yeah.
I mean, my brain put the word real there. They are, of course, both real, but
yeah,
which one is living? So,
do you give away the answer at this point for the benefit of the chat, or do you?
Oh, go on then. I'll tell chat that it's the one on the right is a waxwork, but they have the same grin, and it's just it's so close.
Yeah. And I said to you, I think the only thing I could really differentiate it by when I knew that was looking at the slightly deader eyes of the person on the right. But then, most people in showbiz have quite dead eyes anyway. So,
True.
that's not surprising. And I thought it was almost that the one on the right was teasing us with suggesting its reality, especially by the hint of side boob that was rendered, quite faithfully, it seems. But that was a genuine oddity. I thought maybe it was actually just a Photoshop mashup of two separate photos of the living person.
Oh, I wouldn't be that cruel.
No,
I wouldn't. So this idea of the ambiguously animate dolls that may have a life, classic of horror. You can come up with so many of these. I'm not going to give you many of them. This is an absolute staple. What I'm showing you is one of the best ones. This is Hugo the Dummy from Dead of Night from 1945. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's absolutely wonderful. One of my favorite horror movies. And this one just straddles the line for so long over whether the ventriloquist is insane, whether Hugo really is alive. You are kept in that painful, ambiguous place where you just aren't certain. Hugo is obviously not a human, but the idea that he has some kind of totemic force in him, it's a primitive belief, but it's one that we can't exactly put down. And Freud will name this in his final section. He'll say effectively this is one of the key forces of the uncanniness, one of the key aspects of it is the recurrence of something we have claimed to be past, have claimed that we don't really believe anymore. And yet you are kept in doubt over Hugo. If someone's actually got a creepy doll, you maybe you believe, it's a doll, it's not alive, but you wouldn't really want it staring at you. You might cover it up. I've extended his idea a little bit for the ambiguously animate, and I thought I'd bring in the idea of the sort of obscured faces, which is also a horror trope. So this is obviously Halloween. The idea that someone wears a mask of just a human face and can be out in public is instantly sort of throwing off uncanny vibes. What are they covering up? What's their real face like?
And it's
How
sort of
should
combined.
I interact with them when this very basic aspect of communication is cut off because they're wearing a mask?
Yeah, I was going to say it sort of combines two of those elements, doesn't it? This sort of synthetic, appearance of the inanimate object, the mask invested with anima, and the eyes, especially if that's is that Michael Myers in a
It is
Halloween
indeed.
film,
Yeah.
so that excuse the noise in the background there. With that particular mask, the eyes are kind of hollow, so you think the thing is looking at you, but you don't see any eyes. There is that sort of terrible ambiguity about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Which
Definitely.
ambiguity in
That's a
itself.
really good point, actually. Just the communication is so disrupted, but there's also the element that Carpenter wisely threw in that this just happens in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And it's such a sort of alarming disjunction to the things that you are familiar with.
Yeah.
But really, that is just a man. We've got another one here now. I will risk problems with monetization here. This is also some sort of I have to join this together. Freud goes beyond talking about dolls to talking dolls that might be human to talking about humans that might be dolls. And it's a very clever conjunction here because he brings in things that he's seen in his practice. When humans are not well, are severely mentally ill or are severely damaged, they can stop behaving, how can I say, like humans we can rationally deal with, and they can start to show almost mechanical aspects. Basically, they can seem broken in a way that makes them seem more like machines. And that throws off a very disturbing effect that he's right to highlight. I think it's a very canny observation. And I've got a weird example for you here. So this might seem like a bit of a reach to you, but I thought it was a more sensitive one than others that might come to mind for that topic about sort of broken humans. And it's the idea of humans not walking properly, not moving in an odd way. Now, I may have a bit of problem showing this, so if I ask you to cover for me for a while, while I find the exact bit I need.
Yeah, there's something about, as you say, we're entering a definition of the uncanny from Freud that's coming from the notion of automatic behaviors or automaticity in things like, if you like, mental illness, where a person appears to be directed by something other than their quote normal personality, and also in certain kinds of physical illness. So if you've got something like epilepsy, for example, that is going to be something which you see rendered an apparently normal person who is contrived to be taken over by something else. So this perhaps feeds into extant religious ideas of possession or some kind of immanent evil within a person, which again lends an ambiguity to how you relate to the subjects that you're dealing with. And I suppose you'll see it in various forms in films. You'll have characters who are mute, which as we see in something like or very limited, let's say, in their speech faculties, which lends a disturbing feel.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest sort of comes to mind for that, actually, for showing some of those. Yeah, sorry, it took me a while to find there, Simon. It's a bit of a pain. to get my entirely legitimate copy of Carry On.
I did my best.
You're a star, darling. Don't worry. I'm going to show you a brief bit of this. It's probably going to get copyright claimed, but here we go. See if you notice something about this. There shouldn't be any sound over it. And I just want you to focus on how she's walking, especially her hair. I'll see if I can go back a bit there. Watch her hair, and it'll give you the clue. Okay, that will be enough. So if you didn't catch that, she's actually walking backwards. That was filmed backwards, and then sorry, she walked backwards, and that footage was then reversed. Basically, it gives it a dreamlike quality, an unusual quality. You know she's walking, but there's just, unlike say the characters who've spoken backwards and it's been reversed in the Black Lodge in Twin Peaks, where it's very obvious what's going on. This is a more subtle use of sort of reversing backwards movement. But you know it feels off when you watch it. She's not just walking slowly. There's something wrong with the way she moves, and you can catch it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's something about this that reminds me of. I think I may have seen this mentioned in relation to the uncanny literature. You know, the legend of Caspar Hauser. This young boy. This was in the sort of early or mid 19th century in Germany. He was this young lad who was sort of discovered, just wandering the streets. I think it was Nuremberg, and he basically, the story was he claimed he'd been kept in a cellar. And he was sort of found as this odd phenomenon, because he was completely desocialized from the point of speech or social interaction, and his ability to kind of negotiate physical space was also kind of distorted as well, presumably. I don't know great detail about the story, but I think it's one of those things that's often cited as a sort of a historical remnant that feeds in, like you're talking about, this nature of disjointed movement. I don't know, isn't there something like that in The Exorcist as well? Someone coming down the stairs.
Yes, the spider walk sequence. It's in the director's cut.
Right.
The subsequent editions keep it in, as it was a bit of a. It didn't really work with the flow of the movie, and I've got to say it's not the greatest effect because it's
but
very
certainly
transparently not the same actress, but
but there's certainly something in that about these forms of what I suppose are, I don't know what you'd say in medical terms, dyskinesia, sort of odd movement, or unbidden movement.
Yeah, and any sort of anyone who's got the joy of being double jointed or Ehlers loss can show you some very unusual movements, and it's amazing how little a difference you need in a movement for us to feel something's wrong and have quite a strong reaction to it. Realize I might need to speed this up a little bit for us. So the other big topic that Freud gives as an example is the doppelganger. We have double, but doppelganger is just so much better. And this is uncanny on several levels. It's already got an ambiguity about an identity. We're used to thinking of egos, individual, particular egos, and then seeing some sort of physical double is sort of a challenge to that. Makes you doubt that. Also, with the idea of you having your own doppelganger who looks exactly like you is an even stronger challenge to individuality. The idea that there's this other version of you out there. Now, Kubrick obviously is the master of this. He's gone one level beyond the Das Unheimlich in the Grady twins, who are, of course, not actually twins. They're just the daughters. But Kubrick really cannily forced the two sisters to be dressed as if they were twins, even though they're clearly not identical, and it's that idea of he's tried to force a conformity onto them, force a symmetricality onto them that isn't there, and so they have this even more sort of disjointed effect. Like you're being told they're identical, but they're very much not.
Yeah, and this notion of there's doubles and doppelgangers. So that the doppelganger, in the sort of like remnant legend that I would certainly recall would be the idea that you meet your double and that this is a sign of your imminent death. But Freud talks about the notion of the double. Let's say, I mean, we are presented here with these twins they are facing us. They are not our doppelganger, but they are doppelgangers of each other. But the idea that the doppelganger is a sort of it evolves out of a psychological strategy to deny death. To you double up on your personhood, so you will perhaps, if one of them dies, the other one will go on. It's kind of a way of conceiving of an immortality, and the basic defiance of the fear of death. And this is something that recurs actually throughout literature. Even in Shakespeare, I recall there's the scene at the end of Richard II where he's in prison and he's entirely and utterly alone and trying to reflect on his failure as a king. And of course, he conceives of populating the world of the prison with all of these little people that he makes up in his head, these little almost like homunculi who kind of he can talk to and relate to and indeed be king of. And this is a sort of an interesting way of him deferring kind of what he knows is coming, which is going to be his own death. An attempt to hide in the crowd almost. So it helps exclude the fear of death.
Yeah, in the essay, there's talk of sort of totem masks, pharaoh masks. One can also think of statues and portraits that are meant to give that longevity. But then, what's the quotation? But these ideas arose on the soil of boundless self-love, the primordial narcissism that dominates the mental life of both the child and the primitive man. And when this phase is surmounted, the meaning of the double changes. Having once been an assurance of immortality, it becomes the uncanny harbinger of death. We see those doubles, numerous other places, but the one I went for as an interesting one, one of the places I thought he used it most intriguingly is Lost Highway. Patricia Arquette's various characters in that.
And even in I was going to throw in just a sort of even a more basic pop culture reference. You have the idea of the uncanny quality of this approaching someone who is your double. It's an ambiguous sense of our own hesitant insight into ourselves, which is it's sort of resolved at the moment that the double is met. So it's kind of not an effect of uncertainty, as Freud talks about in the beginning of the essay, but it's a weird kind of morbid compulsion that you go towards to uncover the hidden truth or the unhidden truth. And an example that strikes me thinking about it is, there's the bit in The Empire Strikes Back where Luke is training on Dagobah and he has to go into this tree or something to encounter his fear. Yeah. And of course, what he finds in there is Darth Vader, and he has a lightsaber duel and he strikes off his head. And as the smoke is clearing, he looks into the broken helmet of what he thinks is Darth Vader. And of course, he sees his own face. And this becomes a sort of revelation as to his own possible imminent evil because he can't control the Force at that point.
I did not expect an Empire Strikes Back reference there, but yeah, I'm very interested in what you said about having to seek out the double to resolve it.
Yeah, and Freud's aware of something about the power of the uncanny that lies in it being unresolved. He talks, as we may hit upon later, about the nature of literary creation being that if you kind of overdo the reality to an extent, it becomes unremarkable. Or if you hit it on the nose too much, it's the uncanny is something glanced out of the corner of the eye in a way.
Yes, that is very key. It works best if it's sort of lingering on the periphery of your consciousness. I don't think I've actually said at any point in the stream so far, but if anyone's wondering what's in the background of all these slides, it's once again Dead of Night from 1945. But I chose that because it starts with our protagonist coming in and having an uncanny experience, a déjà vu, where he becomes uncertain whether or not he's visited the house he's currently in before. And fantastically relevant, he's sort of dissuaded and argued against by a big old Austrian psychiatrist who's a sort of smug know-it-all. So I thought it was very, very handy for us to have these characters in the background of every slide. I'm wondering what it is about meeting the double that enables the resolution. Is it sort of lets you confirm that there really is an other, versus wondering whether these things floating around are you or not? The Machinist comes to mind as another example of this.
Yeah, he talks about the kinds of things he gets with some of his patients who are especially male neurotics. And he has a section talking about how they can conceive in terms of a magical thinking that, for instance, he describes one of his patients who I think went to a health spa, had very, good experience at the health spa, goes back to the health spa, finds that someone else, an old man, has taken his room, and off the cuff he says, "Oh, I wish death upon him," and then he finds out later that the old man has died, and through this, process that Freud identifies with the infantile ego, what he calls the omnipotence of thought, he ends up believing, this neurotic, that his omnipotent thought has killed this old man. Of course, this is nonsense, but that becomes like a kind of predestination anxiety. So the sense of the self as with this other sort of magical capability to use one's thoughts to literally strike people dead, this again lends this weight to the idea of the double, or the division within the self even. That's something when we've talked briefly in the past about things like the TV show Severance, where there is a very explicit division between the self at work and the private self and so on. And that's one example where you can see the uncanniness of it, even if you look at the TV, the credits of the show, where you've got these doubles of the main character, and this he's kind of running around trying to find himself, and he's literally climbing into his own head to try and take control of the situation,
and views himself as operating a sort of shell of himself. Yes.
Yeah. So there's an element of it that proceeds out of a kind of a desire to resolve the self, and also perhaps a kind of a sort of a hidden narcissism that the uncanny can kind of embody. I was thinking in particular of things, like when we did the M.R. James stuff and Whistle and I'll Come to You. There's a kind of narcissistic character there, Professor Parkin, who finds this whistle and blows on it, and then the other one, The Warning to the Curious, where our sort of amateur archaeologist Paxton has this kind of autodidactic desire and a wish to affirm the Heimlich, the homely. He wishes to find something that will give him, sort of credit with himself. So there's a sense of those people having these kind of narcissistic drives as well, and I think that relates to something that Freud's talking about with doubles here. This attempt to sort of mediate the problems of the self by dividing the self So not just doubling, but also dividing within.
And I'm thinking the people he would be meeting, I don't find it hard to believe that they would be more prone to it. But that aspect of a sort of narcissistic, I mean, that sounds harsh, but we'll go with it. A sort of narcissistic assumption about impact on reality is, I thought was actually really, really key to that uncanny feeling. It shows up in two more things. I mean, I've got that section you were just talking about on screen there. The starting section on repetition and implications of artificiality, because I felt all of these things kind of hint at the idea of the world not being as you see it, and you being abstracted from it in some way. Basically, the idea of the world not being real, and you getting clues about this. I'll just go back a few shots because I thought the intro to that was what we've called psychogeography, which is effectively your mind shaping the world to some extent, or your surroundings being reflective of your mind state. Won't be surprised, folks. This is a Shining, obviously, another example. Why have I used this? Partially because throughout, I mean, for so many reasons. On one level, the idea of the maze in the hotel, and the hotel being, in a way, like a mind palace, itself a maze where people get frequently lost, where you, the viewer, gets confused about where you are. You get confused whether you're seeing a diorama of the maze outside the hotel, or the maze, which is actually then the maze itself. But speaking of that maze, what I'm now showing you is the external of the hotel, the overlook. You'll note there's no maze there. It's not actually there. You're shown this at the start of the film, at numerous points throughout the film. The maze is not physically there. Now that causes a bit of a disjunction in your brain. You might be thinking, oh, that's just a one-off, they found a nice hotel that didn't have it, so it's not a problem. They could have corrected for that, but it's one of numerous points in the hotel, in The Shining, where you are shown an impossible geography. And the idea of that is to unsettle you, because mentally you are not consciously doing it, but your brain is trying to keep a track of where things are. You won't be surprised that the number one person to look up on this is Rob Agar. This idea I got from him first. But he shows all sorts of things where you'll say, an easy one to catch is when Jack goes in for an interview with Mr. Ullman. You see from the outside, and this is the example I showed you, Simon. You're seen clearly behind Ullman's office is a corridor, because people are going into it. And then you go into Ullman's office, and there's a window that is lit from the outside. So a window facing the outside that is clearly meant to, there would be a corridor there.
Yeah.
But they've designed the set, meticulously to throw you off, to confuse you. And it's one of many times throughout the film where it's just meant to subtly make you question your understanding and throw you off and give you an uncanny effect, because there is this ambivalence.
And it's a re-articulation of the idea of the disembodied reflected in the literal architecture of the hotel, so that the hotel is like this collection of these severed elements sort of jammed together in a way that doesn't make any coherent sense anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get into more abstract, because I think when we talked about this previously, Simon, and we took psychogeography into a slightly different state that I think is really valuable, that we'll use for applying slightly outside of film. But just from the world of cinema still, Psycho. So great psychogeography here to throw you off, here to be uncanny. The fact that the area where Norman works, the motel, is overlooked literally by this quite creepy looking house. He's always got mother looking down at him. You know, that is an element of psychogeography. The setup, I suppose there's a bit of a crossover with the pathetic fallacy here, but the external conditions are mirroring the internal one. I'll give you another one here. Probably, frankly, this could be a better example than even The Shining. This is Possum from 2018, where basically every location your man visits, and he compulsively, repetitively visits them, may not be as they actually are in reality. There's a certain dated 1970s quality to them. And you start to realize over the course of the film that perhaps we're so inside this man's head that we're seeing the world as he sees it, dated back in the 70s, and that he's sort of trapped in his own mental landscape. I'm trying not to spoil a fantastic film. We did cover it on the channel. A disturbing watch, a very good one, and written specifically for a collection of horror stories that are employing the ideas of Das Unheimlich. So I'm not reaching with that one. It's very deliberately trying to use Freud's ideas. I'm just checking. Oh yes, I have one more rather horrific example from Possum of psychogeography, where you're able to see the well, this is your man in the woods, where even a tree starts to gain a sort of horrifying impression of what's going on inside his head. But when we talked about psychogeography, Simon, there was a slightly different meaning to the word. Oh, and we've lost Simon. Right, hopefully we get our man back. I'll spoil you on the other side of it. So there's a sense of psychogeography in which, as you walk along in your life, you start to give your own, how can I say, your own impressions. So you start to make these associations between your own memories and the landscape, and to effect, you sort of map on to locations, memories and feelings and states that then can become distorted. And I think that's a sort of key one, because, well, maybe that will take us slightly astray. Hopefully we will get Simon back soon. He may have had a computer die on him. I'll see. Oh, there we go. Okay, don't worry. Simon will be back. We'll be back. I'll tell you what, I'll move us on and not drown us in psychogeography. But that is just another element of the uncanny. It's ambivalence, associated meanings. So a sort of, something you're familiar with that has also this additional quality to it. I would be remiss if I did not get it. Now, another element where we are going to move slightly beyond Freud's essay here that's very important, and probably one you're all familiar with here. Obviously, you're all familiar with this one. The implications of unreality. Now, Freud gets to this in a number of ways. There was the example that Simon talked about earlier, the chap going to the health spa. I've got you this extract. It was on screen for quite a while ago. But the idea is sort of your wishes actually impact the world. Well, there are other ones. So Freud talks about recursion, repetitions of things that are nominally harmless, but when you see enough of them, you start to wonder if something's going on. Now, in his case, it was sort of seeing a number multiple times. You don't think anything if you, that you see the 67 bus go by. But if you then walk down the street and see, a shop with 67 in the name, or you see then graffiti on the wall saying 67, the number 67 starts to gain a meaning to you. It starts to gain an association, something uncanny. I've just used a number there for something innocuous, but it could be anything. something can become a symbol simply through this repetition, and through you noticing it, you start to get an uncanny feeling about that symbol, whatever it is. Now, that's obviously deployed quite widely in all sorts of TVs. I'm sure you don't need me to give you an example of this, of something that was just used multiple times that's otherwise innocuous and is just gained. Yes, exactly, John Gorris. 69 all over the interweb. See, an absolutely innocuous number, and yet you see it all over the place, and you just start to think something's going on. So I thought I'd go a little bit outside of what Freud talks about. I mean, maybe folks, if you want to throw the symbols that come to your mind, and Simon has returned.
Apologies. Lost power in my my whole street there for some reason. So that was a very uncanny moment. Literally everything just went black. So thank you for your patience. Good.
No problem. You've come back at the time of an absolutely perfect example.
Okay.
Nico's come back in when we talk about the repetition of numbers. Looking at the clock at 1, 2, 3, 4, I do this for. I can't help but if the clock's about to go like 1, 1, 1, 1, or 2, 2, 2, 2, or even better, 3, 3, 3, 3. Well, you've got to watch. You've got to watch until it makes it there. Then, but yeah, the simple thing it would stand out to you. I was thinking of where we go a little bit beyond Freud here, in terms of something quite neurotic, of feeling that the world is artificial and that you have quite an impact on it. I would posit that films deliberately trigger this when they mess with the fourth wall. A preeminent example I was sort of waiting to see, has anyone caught this one? If you're too polite, chat, you can take the credit. Don't worry, you can name the films. We'll be impressed. This is Funny Games from 1997. This is Michel Haneke, who made fantastic use of the uncanny in a film called Cachet, which also gets on this idea of sort of paranoid surveillance, but just the moment of a character looking directly at you and then communicating as if to you has that unsettling effect. Do you think I'm stretching that a bit, Simon, for
No,
an
not at
uncanny
all.
effect?
I mean, I wonder if that's probably when was the film made again?
97.
It was 97. Was that far back? I mean, it just echoes the Disaster Girl meme, doesn't it? You know, the little girl with the burning house in the background. It's before its time, in that sense of slightly dangerous complicity that you have with the situation in the film. Because I think from my memory of that film, and I haven't seen it for a very long time, but it's about a certain kind of middle class passivity in the face of danger and threat, and trying to we'll talk about this maybe a bit later, about trying to normalize and incorporate that into your world. Obviously, it's something that's very topical of the moment, where people are trying, despite their best efforts, not to notice the kind of the menacing nature of their own environment.
Yeah, it's and exactly, there's that ambiguity, the tension, the multiple layers of meaning, the fact that you're trying to remain proper whilst things get increasingly tense. That's enough. But then you've thrown in the element that someone is looking, one character is directly aware of you and slightly annoyed by you. In the German version, Austrian original version, people always confuse Austrians with Germans. It must be infuriating. But there's a shot that is in this that is not in the shot-for-shot remake, where our character here, I think his name is Carl, I could be wrong, he gets actively annoyed at you, and he throws a ball at the screen. I think maybe they thought that was a bit too much, so they cut that out, but I liked it. And there's dialogue he has with his accomplice, which is quite clearly meant for you to understand, but the other one isn't aware of you. And it's, yeah, layers of ambiguity there. But I thought I'd bring you one from The Shining as well. Kubrick, being an absolute perfectionist, would not accidentally have Jack Nicholson at multiple points in the film, and we're talking dozens of points in the film, catch very quick glimpses of the camera, look directly into it so briefly, and then move on. But there are dozens of these, and I think the idea is, to unsettle you further. Like these brief moments of, wait, did he break the fourth wall? Did he look at me? Has the illusion been shattered? He's just, my favorite was this one because he kind of looks at you with disgust very briefly as he leaves the apartment. There have been some great compilations of these, by the way, so you want to look and just prove it's not accidental. There are dozens of these of Jack, and only Jack, looking directly at you. And then for other people, you sort of breaking the fourth wall and being aware that they are in a fiction. Obviously, David Lynch is our key. He became incredibly interested in this idea from Twin Peaks onwards. Lost Highway, outstanding example, and a lot of films really sort of are only comprehensible if you understand them as characters becoming aware of themselves being trapped in a fiction. But I won't Lynch post for too long. And I'm Lost Highway posting again. The Mystery Man, a wonderfully uncanny character who turns up to basically break the rules of the film for the first protagonist.
Yeah, and this is almost like an embodiment of the repressed in one way as well. That this character, he's weirdly familiar. You've met me before, have I? Yes. You've met me at your house, whatever.
I'm there right now.
Yeah. So again, this is kind of an avatar for this feeling or something that's been suppressed and that is coming out into the open to confront you, and it obviously discombobulates the main character. It's the kind of it's a sort of libidinal suddenness of the unexpected. It goes straight to the core of fear in that way.
Yeah. But it's right there. It's in the open. Can you challenge it? It's a party atmosphere. No one else finds him weird. But he's just there. In fact, if you want to take it further, Simon, I mean, the uncanny in Lost Highway, we could go on forever, but it all kicks off with the home being invaded, or knowledge of the home being captured on videotapes in a way that should not be possible. Cameras moving around the house in a way that they should not be able to do. No one knows who did it. So it's within the home, within the Heim, with an uncanny vibe to it. And there's this really key line in it from Bill Paxton, oh gosh, whichever one he is. Oh dear, I really should know.
I'm betting on Pullman.
I think it should be Pullman.
Not the one who's not dead.
Yeah. He's asked by the police if he filmed the footage, and he says he hates cameras. He likes to remember things how he remembers them. It's something to that effect, but yeah, that idea of your subjective reality, you don't want it overridden. He's got his idea of his home that's Heimlich to him, and yet this camera can have a completely different view of his space and wreck it for him. It's like, yeah, anyway, we could drill into Lost Highway. Oh, and of course, one further level to that. The home they actually filmed in was owned by Lynch. It was, in a way, his own home that he'd designed the furniture for and everything. So many levels to that one. This is slightly adjacent. I wanted to give us a more modern example. Are you familiar with It Follows?
Not me, no.
Oh, right. For the purposes of the uncanny, it works very. There is an entity which, if you have the curse of the film, it follows you. That's all it does at walking pace. It follows you until it catches you. Then you have a nasty end. And this thing just follows you constantly in daylight, and it takes many forms, but you're frequently shown something like kind of unremarkable. It's just an old woman walking, but the way she moves and moves so intently on you, it's almost fourth wall breaking. She often looks directly at the viewer and walks straight to camera, but it's that's all they're doing is walking. It's just this unsettling uncanniness to the movement. The movement's a bit wrong. They're in the wrong place. They seem to be very aware of the audience and walking to us. But at other points in the film, you're just unsure if any random person in the street is the creature. And that ambiguity just adds so much to how unsettled you are.
And it sort of ties with this sort of image of something like the zombie in the kind of early or middle period of zombie films in the 70s, where as you say, the movement is kind of persistent and like an approaching menace, but it doesn't have any sort of overt kinetic kind of threat to it. It's just the relentlessness of it. That's it. The movement and the inevitability. Again, that idea of a predestined doom that is so inescapable. It doesn't need to rush at you. It's going to get you at some point. And this is again like this notion of the fatalism in the uncanny is about the automatic processes, automatic processes of the mind, automatic processes of biology that are visiting and revisiting. And I mean, I don't know if we've got into the theme of just recursion itself as a key element.
We briefly touched on it while you're away on the idea of things recurring. Innocuous things recur, but that nature of noticing them can give weight to a symbolism and create a symbol.
Yes. Yes.
There's another. If you had something on that, please.
I was just going to say that. Did you talk about the episode in the essay where Freud goes into an example from his own life of recursion?
Goodness, no! I missed it. And I had a note for that. There's one of my favorite bits.
Fascinating anecdote that he talks about. He's kind of strolling along in an area of an unfamiliar town, and he describes this example of getting lost and coming back to the same place again and again and again. And it just happens to be this part of the town populated by, should we say, ladies of the night.
Well, if you have the essay open, Simon, would you mind reading it? Because the phrasing is perfect. It's on page 144.
I can certainly look to find it again. If everything in my browser hasn't completely crashed, which it did when... here we go. Okay, so let's see if I can just find that little bit where it is.
Just a reminder, it was one of my favourite bits, and I completely forgot.
I think it's in part 3 of the essay. I have a feeling where he's talking
page 144.
Yeah, I've got.
It's part two, and it's.
Right.
That was it. The section strolling one hot summer afternoon.
Let me just bring it down. I'll search for it that way. Gosh, I don't know if I can find it. All right. Yeah. Okay. So this is Freud. The factor which consists in a recurrence of the same situations, things, and events will perhaps not appeal to everyone as a source of uncanny feeling. From what I have observed, this phenomenon does undoubtedly, subject to certain conditions and combined with certain circumstances, awaken an uncanny feeling, which recalls that sense of helplessness sometimes experienced in dreams. Once, as I was walking through the deserted streets of a provincial town in Italy, which was strange to me on a hot summer afternoon, I found myself in a quarter, the character of which could not long remain in doubt. Nothing but painted women were to be seen at the windows of the small houses, and I hastened to leave the narrow street at the next turning. But after having wandered about for a while without being directed, I suddenly found myself back in the same street, where my presence was now beginning to excite attention. I hurried away once more, but only to arrive yet a third time by devious paths in the same place. Now, however, a feeling overcame me, which I can only describe as uncanny, and I was glad enough to abandon my exploratory walk and get straight back to the piazza I had left a short while before. Other situations having in common with my adventure an involuntary return to the same situation, but which differ radically from it in other respects, also result in the same feeling of helplessness and of something uncanny. So that's a great example. And I had an example of this happen to me once. This is a strange anecdote, but I was with a friend. We went on motorbikes across to Switzerland. So we went across France and down into Switzerland. And then when we came back, we ended up in a town near the German border called Metz. And my friend was sort of a bit knackered, and we sort of checked into a hotel. And I said, I'll go out and find some food for us, because there was nothing in the hotel. It was one of these kind of, pod hotel type things that were just very limited in what they had. So I rode off into Metz, and Metz is this medieval town with a sort of very strange road system. And I ended up, going round and round and finding myself on this same street in Metz, trying to get back, trying to find the right road back to the hotel. And I remember it was an extremely uncanny feeling, because I kept coming up on this kind of dark and lonely residential street where there was no one about. There were no lights in the houses. And the one notable thing was there was a sort of drinks machine, like a Coca-Cola vending machine in the middle of the street. And I rode around for about 3 hours, going in circles, never finding the way back to the hotel, and coming back to this street again and again. And I mean, I finally in the end, I stopped and bought a Coke, because it seemed like the only thing that I was being, invited to do at that point. But
That's what you needed to do to pass the quest.
Yeah. It was a sort of fugue state where people kind of lose themselves in this, circular, voyage, and begin to. I mean, I began to really panic, because I thought I'd never get back. But it's akin to the sorts of theories you've heard of when there was the sort of famous incident, the Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19, and there were these 5 American, sort of fighter bomber planes that were sort of doing an exercise. They went into the Bermuda Triangle and disappeared. And one of the theories was that when these guys were flying, they were radioing back to base saying, well, the compasses have stopped working. We'll try and find our way back. And the theory is they probably got into a similar kind of panicked fugue state, because they clearly were out of whack with their actual location. They didn't realize where they were, and just kept flying round and round and round until they ran out of fuel and probably crashed into the sea. So that sort of anxiety about recursion is something which I can certainly recall from the stream we did about In the Mouth of Madness, where the Sam Neill character is simply struggling to escape the town, and we see him, constantly recurring in the same place in a sort of Kafkaesque way, unable to elude his the sort of zombie-like pursuers in the town.
There's I mean, that's a fantastic example. I was going to reference House of Leaves, but yeah, In the Mouth of Madness is even more direct about the inability to escape. There's it occurs to me there's a little bit of a tension in the idea of the uncanny. You reference a fatalism. I was just thinking some of these, they are fatalistic. Like something happens to you, you're the victim of a thing that generates an uncanny response, and others are like the whole, actually you are the actor, like the things where you control the world with your mind, really. Yeah, it's an interesting tension. We've got the two kinds, and I don't think Freud draws that out in the essay, but it's just interesting. Those are the last examples I had from movies of where the ideas have shown up in films we're aware of, but I couldn't help but reach elsewhere for examples of the uncanny, some of which did in fact make their way back into horror. So I'm not exactly cheating here, but I thought I'd reference René Magritte, a chap who greatly enjoyed messing with the medium and deploying the uncanny here. The connection to horror is, and there are several, but I just thought I'd draw on the one on the left, is the Empire of Light, which is sort of the inspiration for the poster of The Exorcist, the famous scene in The Exorcist of Father Merrick. It's Merrick. Yes, Merrick is the elder priest. Merrick arriving at the house was inspired by Empire of Light here. He did a couple of these. This is my preferred one. And it has that uncanny effect because the lighting on the house does not match the lighting in the sky. You're left with that sense of unease. Like, these are, I know the sky. Sure, I know sunny days and I know nights, but why are they together? How can they be together?
Yeah, this sense of the disjunction in the rules about the world you think you're experiencing is...
Yeah. And the other one is, I've forgotten the name of it. It is Not to be reproduced. Reproduced even. That's he liked messing with mirrors a lot and reflections that were not accurate. He did this in many forms. This is just one of the ones I like. And another uncanny effect he generated is when he got his hands on cameras. Magritte would take portraits where he obscured his face, as if to, the entire point of the exercise is to get a photograph. This is novel. Hey, we can have a high quality photo. And he would do this. He would obscure his face, like putting the portrait, or you may have seen the one where he has a chessboard in front of his face, just obscuring himself, or he would have his friends all face away from the camera. It sounds a bit hipster now, but
well, there is an interesting thing again in the essay about this, where we're sort of touching on the uncanny and the real as we experience it here. And Freud has this footnote in a part of the essay where he himself is surprised by his own image as an uncanny phenomenon. He talks about, he says, I was sitting alone in my wagon-lit compartment. He's on a train. When a more than usually violent jerk of the train swung back the door of the adjoining washing cabinet, and an elderly gentleman in a dressing gown and a travelling cap came in. I assumed that he had been about to leave the washing cabinet, which divides the two compartments, and had taken the wrong direction and had come into my compartment by mistake. Jumping up with the intention of putting him right, I at once realised to my dismay that the intruder was nothing but my own reflection in the looking glass of the open door. So he's this works as the uncanny because he himself is in a mode of feeling where he's not paying attention to himself. He's in absentia of the self. He's inhabiting it in the mode that we mostly do in our lives, where we're preoccupied, and that's at odds with the image, or the imago, as theorists would say, the idealization of the self. There's a game being played here with these images about seeing what is the real self and obscuring the real self. It's like those leftist memes you get, the one of how you think you look and how you actually look. You have the sort of, you think you look like the revolutionary Che Guevara, and they contrast that with the image of the sort of chubby gamer fantasist with a Che Guevara t-shirt on. The relation to the iconography, always kind of wanting with that disjunction of the self, because we occupy it in different modes. I mean, that's important to something like we talked about before this stream at one point about the world of Black Mirror. And this is the thing of, we are observing these kinds of uncanninesses, and they make sense as the dramatically uncanny, whereas in the real world, they are something that we're perhaps somewhat detached from, because to an extent we have allowed them to persist. I don't know if you want to go into this bit yet, but there's this thing of being sort of blind to the uncanniness in real life, because of how much we accept its kind of its perverse premises. I don't know
Well,
if there's
that would be. We could move into it actually. Tell you what, I put the next slide up. Just I smuggled in one of my favorite artists. You wanted to reference this chap, so maybe we'll talk about him briefly, and then we'll move into our conclusion.
Yeah, this is Ron Mueck. He's a sculptor. Very interesting guy. Look up his work. And he does what are essentially hyper-realistic sculptures of people. And, they're kind of very sort of fleshy looking sculptures, as you can see here. Famously, he did one called Dead Dad, which was a sculpture of the body of his own father after death, just as a naked corpse. And it's very interesting in the way that this relates to the uncanny. What Mueck often does is he does these sculptures that are not in the same one-to-one scale as us. He either does these figures that are very big, outsized, like you see here, or sort of smaller. And the one of the Dead Dad is particularly interesting. If you just see a photograph of it online, you'll see it's usually photographed against a white background. Of course, you can't tell the scale. But when you see it in a gallery, it's a figure that's only about 3 feet tall, lying on its back, dead as a corpse, as he may have observed his father. And there's elements of the uncanny in it, because you see this sort of ambiguity about the state of death as being like a state of sleep almost. You sort of can't quite identify this as a corpse, but there's suggestive elements in the sculpture, and also the fact that it's much smaller than reality. And this is something that actually relates again to my own experience and the experience of other people who've been and seen, for instance, a parent who's died. And in my case, I saw my father after death. And this is something a friend said to me about the same experience when his father died. People seem much smaller. Now, in a sense, I guess they are sort of reduced in volume, because, the body's tissues collapse. The body isn't perfused anymore. So it's not, plumped up like a person with living circulation. And of course, you're usually looking down on a body which has been a significant body in life to you, but which in death seems reduced in scale in this way. And this is what Mueck does with this particular sculpture. And I just ask people to just go and look at some of his other stuff, where he does a massive one of his own face, lying on its side, and it's sort of redolent of something you might see on a picture of a body on a mortuary slab, ultra detailed, the very fine hairs in the face picked out, and yet it seems to be sleeping only. And again, he plays with this distinction between the state of sleep and the state of death. Again, it's another theme you find in sort of, or an anxiety you find in Gothic literature, especially about the notions of things like being buried alive and so on, not being able to distinguish between the states of life and the states of death.
Yes, and in the case of a statue, there is that ambiguity. You can't have the following moment to help you discern. That's the one moment that you get to judge from. It becomes even more ambiguous. Being conscious of time, I think I'll move past that quote. Well, this is this is sort of important. It's the other aspect of recursion here, just quickly, that I'll leave this on screen. You can pause it and enjoy it. But this is, I think, partly the idea that Freud gets to is, I think I have an even better one. Here we go. He talks about old beliefs, old superstitions, you might say. And he says, today we no longer believe in them, having surmounted such modes of thought. Yet we do not feel entirely secure in these new convictions. The old ones live on in us, on the lookout for confirmation, duality on the go. Now, as soon as something happens in our lives that seems to confirm these old discarded beliefs, we experience a sense of the uncanny. I thought that was very well judged. Yeah, the sort of
yeah. I think because he's talking about, it's important to note in this essay, he's talking about different kinds of uncanny, that there are these animistic powered versions of the uncanny, and there are these versions of the uncanny that go back to these deep kind of childhood complexes. And one thing he says about the creation of works in a literary mode, that the animistic notions of the uncanny may not really survive if you're in a world where you're not quite enmeshed in the writer's rules. If the author has fully fleshed out a world, and again, for us, it's perhaps easy to see this in things like film and TV, where a kind of reported naturalism is the way, and everything kind of is sort of meant to make sense, unless you're meant to notice that it doesn't make sense. The uncanny, can survive better or worse depending on how much that immersion controls you. It's like being it's like being in an episteme, as a friend academic agent would say. You're in a sort of holistic reality, and once that reality is contradicted, you're fully immersed in it, then that can create this is going back to Freud's talking about it affects some people in different ways. Some people will be very distressed by disruption to that episteme, that way of being in the world, that mode of thinking, and they will be unable to escape that. And some people, of course, will certainly be able to easily see where the cracks are. Let's say they may think they see right through it as well. And this is, again, a familiar theme of our age. But there is this sort of tripping point. That it's not possible to say that all people will be affected by it in the same way. For many people, they just won't sense the uncanny in that manner, and that again depends on how well the author's created it. And there's also an extent to which, as we said, the uncanny is sort of caught out of the corner of the eye. So if you're trying to replicate the uncanny, and you kind of hit people on the head with it too much, it sort of loses its power. It's something about its incidental quality. It's the fact that it is concealed, that it perhaps occurs more in recollection than in the moment, that elicits that odd feeling.
And it can be, I think, very difficult to pull oneself out of, particularly an episteme or a general accepted worldview in order to do that. But there is an uncanny tension in seeing fractures and strains along it, but actually being able to adjust that viewpoint, I think, takes it out of uncanny. Uncanny, I think you've got to be in it, feeling the strain. But we'll go to an example of stepping out of that. I promised the conclusion for a while. I just remembered. Sorry, I had this. I was tying it back to horror. So this thing about old beliefs and tensions. I was going to say really drives folk horror, as we covered. There's just all of these classic 70s folk horrors were driven by a fear that actually the stable, safe worldview was actually not very safe and stable. And there were all these things waiting to topple it, that it was going to break against old traditions resurgent. And there's a similar theme in a 2005 film called The Skeleton Key. But we're a little short on time, so I'll move us on. I just strongly recommend The Skeleton Key. Where there's sort of how bought in you are to a superstition is a major plot point. Now, his conclusion in a sort of very Austrian Jewish fashion is, I've just called it quibbling, but it's really trying to nail things down. And I think hopefully it's not too harsh to say it's kind of one of the weaker points, because he's relying so much on trying to nail down the uncanny, which he's done a great job of, and try and cement some rules in, when the whole thing is about an aesthetic and an experience and ambiguity. So he spends his time asking, what is it? Why is an animate doll uncanny in this story, but Hans Christian Andersen's talking teacups aren't uncanny? It's sort of it felt like a weak follow-up, like we didn't need to do it, and he has to try and come up with a rule for why one of these phenomena is uncanny in this circumstance and not in another. Even saying, well, if you're making a joke of it, then it stops being as uncanny. If you're doing it for a comedic purpose, it's not as uncanny. And it seemed a bit unnecessary to me. So I didn't want to go too much into that, but he does round off quite nicely. Which I've got on screen. Our conclusion could then be stated as follows. The uncanny element we know from experience arises either when repressed childhood complexes are revived by some impression, or when primitive beliefs have been surmounted and appear to once again be confirmed. I mean, this is what you were just recounting, Simon. So I might actually... I might actually reread that, because I think you summarized it nicely. But I thought maybe just for a brief moment, maybe we were unsure how to end this, but I just thought there were some interesting discussions we had about going. We've gone beyond the essay to talk about horror movies, but maybe we can go beyond horror movies and talk about a little bit about how the uncanny starts to appear in our life.
We had an interesting conversation, actually, trying to sort of look at, and as I said earlier on in the stream, the uncanny is not necessarily, as I say, it's sort of in a literary mode or a creative work like a film. It requires a standoff distance. You have to have this. You have to be able to remind yourself of the memory of that distance between, if you like, an old world, to assess the uncanny effect in the moment, because so much of it becomes normalized that we fail to notice it, or we sort of subconsciously resist it. And we talked about sort of social phenomena, and I identified a few, but in particular we talked about something like the era of the great illness that everybody was going to die from in recent years, and the way that you had the surface features of life but with an invisible threat and a sort of overlay of these behavioral rules that they don't have a compelling quality in the rational sense, but they did resonate with a deep subconscious fear. They were kind of they were tickling that bit of people that, I mean, when we did the Adam Curtis documentary, The Century of the Self, the guy Walter Lippmann used this phrase, the bewildered herd. And people, lapsed into that state. It was a world where, people around you who were once friendly became hostile. Institutions which formerly had made no demands, they acquired this authoritarian aspect, and they were all the while simultaneously projecting this as a kind of beneficent normality. So it was a sort of double social reality in a way. Everything's normal and nothing is normal.
Yes. Well, the familiar activities gained an unfamiliar quality to them. I was prompted by just visiting, what was it? Health center, or it was just some random facility basically, but it still had the signs up. The signs up warning about people staying distant, and it was giving instructions and referencing rules that are demonstrably no one is applying them, but the signs of seriousness were right up there, and it just seemed like there was a tension. Like, is this rule in effect? Is it not? Is it? How was everyone just swept to this under the rug that we're all like, no one cares about that anymore? I mean, one of those moments of extreme uncanniness in that period of a great illness from an unspecified country was a moment a chap called Dave Cullen just said, if I hadn't, I mean, this is very Baudrillard, but he said, if I hadn't if you hadn't seen any news on about it, you wouldn't know it happened. I was like, oh yeah, actually, oof.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that very unsettling, very, very uncanny.
And some of the forms of kind of behavioral organization that happened during that time. I mean, you recall images of, children in schoolyards standing in, little squares that were painted on the ground. And there's almost something about that that's got the kind of the Wicker Man about it, doesn't it? This sort of socialized ritual with these kind of formal protocols, which are sort of also everybody's pretending they're invisible as well. It's for your own good, for ihre Sicherheit, all that kind of thing. And this extends, I think, into other areas that we're very familiar with these days. I talked about that particular phenomenon, but I think there's also something in technology and digital replication processes. You're in this world of there's a difference between copies and digital instantiations, which are not copies, because binaries are just infinitely replicable, and this is something we encounter in places like in social media. So there's a doubt and an uncertainty about identity. If you work on something like Twitter, you've got bots, you've got a form of a digital automata. You do not know there's a person, and yet you have real people with multiple sock accounts. And then you're also in a world where sometimes people disappear. They're no longer apparently there. And you're being presented all the time with algorithmic based advertising. This is very like, the kind of AI confected seductions that you see in something like Blade Runner, where there's a sort of hologrammatic female character, trying to tempt you in a way, like a doll, from a zone that's kind of uninhabited by real desire from the digital realm. And yet the digital realm is attempting to simulate your desire and reflect yourself back to yourself. This is the idea of the algorithm is constantly feeding off your own preferences. You're constantly presented with a version of yourself, and it's seemingly derived through this omnipotent thought process, which is both divorced from you. You don't have control over this stuff. And yet at the same time, it's also blaming you for your own preferences. This is just what you wanted. We've given you what you wanted. You look at something, and it's a sort of, you look at your YouTube feed, and it's a kind of comic montage, which is telling you these are all your repressed feelings that we're dealing with here, and we're representing to you, and it's your subconscious being played back at you, and there's other factors. There's things like the technology, like Alexa, that people use, this inanimate machine, this disembodied voice.
Well, there's just on the recommendations, I'm sorry to butt in, but just something that struck me is that there's a tension as well of you shape it nominally, but then it also shapes you. There's a feedback of like, it will give you your own desires. It will give you better desires.
Yes, it does. But there's a weird thing about, I don't know, I've only used Alexa at one friend's house who has one. I wouldn't have such a thing in my home, but one of the weird things is you can talk to them, and sometimes they'll respond, and other times they'll just maintain a kind of eerie silence, especially if you ask them something against their programming, and they have this kind of secrecy and inscrutability. And they go quiet on you, and you think, oh, they're not going to play with this particular thing I'm asking. And so with the digital realm, you get this kind of sharp relief between, the isolation of people in real life and the on all the time digital persona that people adopt as well. So again, there's an uncanniness about the way, for instance, people, when people send text message. I find myself doing this as well. Mark Fisher, the cultural theorist who I often reference, talks about this. He talks about people spending hours crafting a text message which has just the right level of nonchalance about it when you're responding to someone.
Wow. I think we all felt that. I think we all felt the pain of that observation. That's a little too cutting.
And I'll just go on. There's other areas where you see this in if you like modern capitalism, let's say, as this general economic context. Chain stores with the same layouts. You go into a Lidl in Birmingham, it's the same as a Lidl in Dundee. It's a repetition of presentation. It's hyper surveillance retail environments. You're constantly, the eyes are watching you, the security tags, so there's always this kind of
Oh,
implication
it's
of
for your
guilt.
safety. It's for your
Yes,
safety.
yes.
As a
It's always,
sign tells you, you see the sign saying, smile, you're on
yeah.
CCTV. It's like, but I'm very unhappy about that fact.
Yeah, it's always a slightly malevolent intentionality that is
Mm,
reflected back in these screens where you see yourself walking along the aisle. And
mm,
I find this goes to the sort of repression issue, that a lot of these things initiate a kind of childlike fury in me when, things like the self-service checkout, you have to put your alcohol through and they have to come and validate it, because,
mm,
I mean, I'm clearly over 18, okay, but, or your card is declined. And that's like an emasculating moment in itself.
mm,
You're aware that if well, usually it's because they do this thing where you have to kind of put your number in on your card every so often just to make sure it's you.
mm,
But it always feels like a kind of slight in a way. And it's coming from this impersonal, digital realm. And it's
mm.
it's almost like it's suggesting you're not sufficiently viable. I mean, it's like in Falling Down. I'm not
Yeah,
economically viable.
yeah.
It's a hidden authority sort of fracturing your dignity with this behavioral dissonance. Because in a normal high trust world, you'd be regarded as a legitimate adult. Back
Mm,
in the past, people would just regard you for who you were. You wouldn't be policed in this way. But here, the digital realm creates kind of false self,
mm.
and it elicits this sense of contingent guilt that you might be doing the wrong thing. You're a credit doppelganger, you know that's happening, and this extends into to other areas like work, where you've got this mass repetition of activity orientated around largely concealed rules in behavioral automation. Again, the managerial state represents a lot of this kind of
Mm,
panopticon, all-seeing eye. And in context of work, for many people who work in offices, there's this key psychological pressure of auditing and self-auditing.
mm,
Things like appraisal. I've always hated this thing of whenever I had jobs, and I thought it was a completely alien concept of having an appraisal, because what that is kind of like a therapeutic doppelganger, that
mm,
you sit in the room with some person who is playing your behavior back to you, and you're faced with a sort of implicit terror that if you kind of, if you're seen to be, if your conscientiousness is seen to be absent, it's somehow that is misbehaving, and it's going to be
mm.
exposed. You've become the sort of surveillant eye on yourself,
Yes,
when
yes, you have to
that happens.
report yourself in
Yeah, yeah,
and
and
have someone verify your self-perception.
yes, yes,
It's
and
very
this is the modern
alienating and
this is the
uncanny.
modern
Yeah.
modern version of the eye, the uncanny. I mean,
Mm,
again, this is Mark Fisher talking. He talks about, because the main object of work is just to produce anxiety now. The
mm,
self-auditing, mitigates you against you doing your job, but it downloads all the responsibility in a much deeper sense on you than it did in the past.
mm,
And there's elements of, what he calls business ontology in work, about when you go to work, you fake yourself. There's
mm.
always a kind of pressure to be kind of happy at your job, or somebody at work will
Bring
say,
your whole self to work,
well, yes,
Simon.
yeah. If you expose your displeasure, people say, well, maybe this isn't the right place for you. And there's a kind of implicit threat
Mm,
that, you're thinking, hang on, this is my livelihood. I'm not just going to leave my job because you think I might be a bit unhappy. But I've
yeah,
had the sort of thing where people, managerials, will say, oh, you don't seem to be very happy here. Maybe you should go somewhere else. And so your agency kind of gets blurred and it's dangled over you as a
mm,
sort of coercion. Um, and I mean, lastly, the major thing I thought was there's an element today in politics, the politically uncanny. That
mm,
the leader figure in a party now is always a kind of double of an earlier leader who was more admired. You know, so
mm.
everybody is a kind of new Blair or a new Thatcher. Yeah, and in a sense, there's also a mirror element working at that, because the opposite is everybody's also a new Hitler. It's all,
Oh,
you know
constantly.
in the mirror, it's always 1938. That's and there's elements of the leader is a puppet. People the controlled opposition meme. You know, the leader's not original. You know, they're not genuine. They're manipulated like a puppet or a ventriloquist doll. You know, even the waxworks. I mean, we used to sort of talk about when the Soviet Union was a thing. People would talk about, you know, on May Day at Red Square, they'd all be standing there watching the tanks roll past, and they all look kind of deathly, you know, all like they were on their last legs, and indeed a lot of them were. And they talk about these dreadful old Soviet waxworks, you know. And there's the kayfabe, you know, as academic agent would call it, you know, the unreality of what's being played out, and the doubt about the seriousness. You know, is what you see in politics real? Is it a real conflict, or we're just imagining that these people are fighting each other in this particular party? So you've got an element of omnipotence of thought again. This attribution in politics that we think everybody's a 4D chess master, and they've got an inscrutable, controlling mind. You know.
Yeah.
You know,
well, the omnipotence of thought is also in there, like the attempt to get you to buy in.
Yes.
My vote will change. I've got to vote harder. And it's like, and versus like, I can just look at what this person was saying a few months ago. I suppose maybe a quickest example, you know, we're going to attract that lefty audience, Simon. I think we said too many bad things. We'll bring them back on side for this one. But you have the members of the Conservative Party talking about current things that are bad. That, oh, you got to get us back in and we'll fix this. And every single thing they tweet is hit with, you had 14 years.
Yeah.
It's like, and you cannot tell us this.
Yeah. Well, that's part of a kind of an element of the politically undead returning, you know, the wish that something would revive from the, you know, the failed party, you know, especially the Conservative Party. I mean, this very much features, you know, in the sense of the replication, you know, the party, they're all a bunch of yes men, they're all clones, they're all NPCs, you know. I mean, the Tories especially suffered from this because of the way the party begins to resemble itself in its members. You know, the 80s style Tory. I mean, Harry Enfield made fun of this, the kind of, you know, floppy hair, the sort of big 80s glasses, and a kind of gormless look. And a lot of Tories actually seem to copy that, you know, when they were they all seem to look very similar in that way. And even today, you've got kind of LARPers who will do these replications of this kind of 80s style Tory as a kind of investment in the ideology, you know. And one of the last things about political uncanniness is the dangerous repressed feeling, which is never allowed to emerge and which causes the most fear in the political system. But it keeps recurring. It keeps bubbling up underneath. But it's the major repression, you know, the things you're not allowed to talk about in terms of you know, political priorities. We know they're kind of there, and yet it's a canny dance of trying to negotiate the way around them from a political point of view. So there's all those kinds of tropes that actually, again, they don't strike us as odd in real life, but were you to dramatize the level of dysfunction that the uncanny can represent in those modes, in work, in politics, you know, in the digital realm that we're so enmeshed in, then I think you'd begin to see something. And again, as I say, that's kind of the territory that Charlie Brooker is in with Black Mirror to some extent, of replaying this stuff back at us with this dark inflection and saying, have you noticed we're doing this ourselves? This is not just people sticking chips in their head in the future. There's an element of,
it's a way of giving us that distance to almost give us permission to notice it. It gets to flip us into noticing mode.
Yeah. And it's how much the characters in that world, they normalize and embrace those hazards. You know, that's why it seems odd to us, because of course, if someone wanted to stick a chip in our heads, we'd say, get out of here. But in those TV shows, they go, yeah, fine, I'll do that, and I can replay all my memories. And, you know, hilarious complications ensue. So you see.
Yeah. And I mean, you give me a nice link in, and I like that you did that and sort of covered applications of the uncanny that are not essentially fearful, that it does have all these other purposes. The mention of Charlie Brooker sort of gives me an in to show this, because I think sometimes corporations actually do have that distance themselves, and they are aware of the weirdness of what is meant to be normal.
Mm.
And so I've been a bit, I had to bring this ad in because it has been haunting me. It's kind of an ad where the idea is the product. They're basically trying to normalize you. So it's for the a phone which has got an AI assistant built in all the time, and it knows people find the idea of just talking to the phone as if it were a real person weird. So this is an ad all about just getting people over that line. I'm going to play it for you. It's not long, but we'll just see it as it's an idea. It's not selling you a phone. It's just trying to make you not freak out about talking to software as if it's a person. So I'll just play the ad for you now.
Hello?
Hi, I'm Gemini.
Hi, Gemini?
How can I help you?
So I just talk?
Yes, but
This is you. You are slightly, nonplussed, dumbfounded. I assume a doctor, maybe an engineer here. And you've got your smart female colleagues either side of you. There's a white guy involved, but we don't need to see him. He doesn't get a face.
He's
He
old.
has no personality. Look at him. Oh, dirty boomer. No, he doesn't get a face. In death, you earn a face. His face is Robert Paulson. We will move on. The idea is there just to try and get you over the line because people already find it uncanny. So this ad is made to normalize it for you, which makes it even more uncanny for me.
Yeah.
And so I just thought I had to show it because
Yeah.
we had more like advertising generally is very uncanny just because it's showing you a world that does not really exist.
Yes.
I'll just direct people quickly to the Despot of Antrim's recent video on British adverts for an excellent study in the messaging and sort of jarring unreality of British adverts. We've gone a little bit over time. Ivan the Horrible, I agree with you. I also despise AI. Why would I despise AI? Well, one of the reasons is that I was trying to do my own thumbnail. It wasn't for this, and it let me down horribly. I was, I wasn't sold initially with the ones I used. I thought it would be quite nice if I had the Shining twins with Sigmund Freud's face. But look at the absolute cancer it created. Look at these nightmare visions.
Oh.
It couldn't even get it right. Look at this. But what is this James O'Brien double act that's here in the bottom right? It's awful.
They sort of came up with composites of Freud's face and Jack Nicholson's face in that bottom right one, didn't it? It was,
and it changed so much. It couldn't get my Grady Twins AI. Anyway, absolute nightmare fuel. I'd forgotten about that, Ivan, but you prompted me, so you can enjoy that. So we'll leave there, but it's a rich topic, as you can tell. Hopefully, someone probably could have read Freud's Uncanny in this time, but I'd like to think we were more entertaining and more illuminating than the essay. But
yes,
if you still feel compelled, the essay is linked in the description to this video.
Indeed. And can I just quickly add that there's a concept here that we've used words a little loosely at times, and we talked about linguistic precision at the beginning of the stream and before. There are words like the weird and the eerie. And interestingly, my fave cultural theorist Mark Fisher wrote this essay, "The Weird and the Eerie Beyond the Unheimlich," in which he makes distinctions where the weird is a specific cultural category now, and so is the eerie. I mean, the weird tends to be something that we've discussed as a feature that may look like it's a feature of the Unheimlich, but it's separate. The weird is the kind of juxtaposition or the thing that shouldn't be there. It's the dissonance. And the eerie is very specific in that it's about something that's been emptied out. So in Fisher's case as a Marxist, he's looking, for instance, at spaces that have been abandoned and emptied out of capitalism, or or the way in which the self has been emptied out by psychoanalysis, things like that. So they are also sort of very current in terms of cultural theory, and explorations of those sit alongside and sometimes bleed into the uncanny as well. And they have their but they have a distinct quality as well. The eerie, especially in a lot of modern psychogeography, tends to be people, sort of wandering around, and it's essentially reconstructing histories of places which had histories in the past and maybe now have had that history, abandoned or emptied out of them. And so it's about the associational links that we have when we walk in a landscape, and how we conceive of it, how we reimagine it, and so on. So there's interesting stuff there if you want to look into that particular essay of Fisher's, which can also be found online, the Weird and the Eerie. It was part of his book, The Weird and the Eerie, but Beyond the Unheimlich is the name of the essay.
So there you go, folks. It's additional reading. Get value for money here. No, that good. From the Fisher I read, I liked. He is politically quite far from me, but there's something about coming at things where you're willing to drop all sorts of prior assumptions. Means that they can see things. They can see things and make suggestions in a way that I can agree with. Fresh takes that are maybe more accurate simply because they drop a lot of baggage. But with all that said, Simon, thank you so much for joining me for the stream on the Uncanny.
Pleasure. Sorry about the dropout earlier on, but I could have happily rambled on for another hour or two. So anytime.
Well, that's the danger of it. It's such a rich topic on this, honestly. And chat, I hope you enjoyed it. A massive thank you to everyone who funded this. I should just note this was a bonus stream where people donated to show they wanted to see it, and it's great to be able to pay back. So thank you again for funding bonus streams. I'd like to do more of these. I'd like to do maybe about one a month. Thank you for making it happen. If you're a regular viewer or considering being, just say that most of what I do isn't on this. It's on pure horror movie analysis. And for the month of May, it's a very mixed bag. It's just about rewarding channel members. So we're doing member requests. So there'll be quite an unusual array there. We're starting off with Jennifer's Body from 2009. Quite a leap from this topic to that, but could be an interesting one. I will try and pull out something interesting about that film. Very much forgotten in the current movie landscape. So give that a watch. Jennifer's Body from 2009. We'll be covering that this Thursday. So thank you again, everyone. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend. Good night.